Like many people, I spend hours a day staring at a screen. Sometimes something of value is even happening, but this is how it looks. So now if I want to write a story about me or one of my peers, what do I describe happening? My experience is marked by inaction, immobility, isolation. And let's set aside those questions of intellectual activity and narrating socialization broadly, but look at the distinct challenge in the digital era that, well, this is my character for hours and hours. The future of the book partly relies on authors refining different styles and best practices for such narration. Elsewhere, I'll also be discussing narratives built to be read specifically on computers, but our traditional forms aren't going anywhere, so I'd like to look at some novels. And I'm starting today with some comments on Thomas Pynchon's 2013 novel Bleeding Edge and how and why it moves through different genres. But first, let's return to staring at screens, which figures distinctly as a challenge for the novel to overcome. The character Reg sold bootleg movies, recorded himself on a camera, but he messes around with zooming and framing and so on, and this is a Seinfeld joke, and an NYU professor takes him for a postmodern genius. So now he's hired to do a documentary on a big computer security forum called Hashslingers, and this is early 2001 in this liminal moment between the dot-com bust and 9/11, and from our historical vantage we see the event coming and this new era of technology and surveillance which follows, but right now we're in the died down aftermath of the dot-com bubble, and this Hashslingers company is one of the few firms left which is really booming. But going back to where we started, you have a documentary about a computer security firm. So what would that look like? And so Maxine questions Reg, footage of what? Nerds staring at screens? And this exchange sets off the main plot with Maxine, ex-certified fraud examiner, looking into this tech company, which Reg worries is a little too shady, but this is also setting up a narrative challenge for Pynchon here. Do you have, as Reg jokes, a lot of car chases and explosions? And that's actually not far off. There is a lot of intrigue, and there's even a shootout in Chinatown, but for the most part you have a fraud examiner, a more technical, desk-based alternative to a detective, falling down a paranoia rabbit hole. But that detective element is genre 1, cyberpunk is genre 2. And this isn't Pynchon's first instance of a not-quite detective in what is narratively a roughly detective role. So going back to 1965, his novel The Crying of Lot 49, it follows Oedipa Maas as she is left to execute her ex-husband's will and falls down her own paranoia rabbit hole, trying to piece things together. She discovers what she understands to be a long-standing secret society running an alternate postal system, and strives more and more to make sense of the world, which is slipping away from her. And as she moves through the city and its web of information, she begins to think of the city as like a computer chip, though we're a little too early to carry that point through too far. But fast forward to 1982, and as personal computers start looming on the horizon, we get cyberpunk. In foundational works such as Blade Runner, we get a detective facing some of the existential questions posed by the existence of androids in his world. So that work is doing something new stylistically, but it's drawing heavily on the detective genre for its narrative level, and also film noir for some of its style. But also a couple of weeks after this film, William Gibson's short story Burning Chrome comes out, and he introduces the term cyberspace. Fast forward again to 2003, and Gibson starts off his second trilogy of novels with Pattern Recognition, a work drawing influence from The Crying of Lot 49, but in Gibson's cyberpunk style, set in the world where high tech has taken off in an explicitly post-9/11 world. Like Maxine, Gibson's protagonist works to trace information and symbols through the internet, and so when Pynchon returns to his own Crying of Lot 49 model 10 years later, he also has this cyberpunk model to grapple with. Set up as a bit of an historical novel, Bleeding Edge nevertheless has to work around the utterly undramatic world of nerds staring at screens, and to that end, elements of the detective and cyberpunk genres serve as a bit of a shortcut. Because you have these structures that you know work and you know how they work, you have something to do, something to show, section by section, but now you run the risk of falling too much into those genre conventions, and then you just have a generic novel with a little computerized flair to it. When what you want, looking back at this historical moment between the dot-com bust and 9/11, is something that brings to life that moment. What you don't have is a story of the everyday reality of the average person at this time, some clueless nerd staring at a screen. Maxine is not an everyman, and the scenarios are often not normal life, but there is just enough that's relatable and charming in her affection for her family and friends. What you do get, conspiracy, information overflow, connection and disconnection, and so on, these are central to contemporary life. Conspiracy is classic internet, but it was also classic Pynchon, and so he comes back to it through this lens. In a great review of the novel, Joshua Cohen brings up two great points. One, the September 11th terrorist attacks, which occur toward the end of the novel and loom over the whole story, since you know that they're months away and they're getting closer and closer as time in the story moves on. They mark a shift. Pre-9/11, cell phones exist, but you could be disconnected. And then after, your remote presence was your sign of continued life. And so in the moment, people wanted to get in touch with others and see if they're okay, but phone lines went down, and the desire to get in touch never went away, and we already had just the technology to fill that need. And so Cohen goes on to argue that cell phones are now the chief antagonist of fiction, because our constant connection means that there's no time for misunderstandings that require the gradual movement of characters toward each other to resolve that tension. And so Pynchon, in setting his novel at this precise moment, captures this last fleeting moment of inaccessibility of his characters. And in the shift toward a new online world, Cohen argues that what Pynchon tries to show us through Bleeding Edge is that ultimately still only family is real. And looking back at the novel itself, very clearly Maxine's family is central to the narrative. Despite everything going on that shapes up this really compelling narrative, her everyday reality, what really matters to her, is her kids going to school. And she's in another liminal moment there, right before they become old enough to not need her to walk them there, or where it's sort of acceptable for her to pretend they need her to walk them there. And since one of the big payoffs of the novel is her kids going out into the world, the question then is, what exactly is the world they are growing up into? That world's not quite there yet, but Maxine gets a chance to look behind the curtain. Drawing on decades of cyberpunk and post-cyberpunk, Maxine has these experiences that are also visions in virtual reality. That world's not exactly real, and the dead she meets there aren't actually still alive, but this is a glimpse into the world her children will care about. Gibson once commented that one of his early inspirations was seeing a bunch of kids in an arcade huddled around a machine, and this is the early 80s with all the simplistic graphics that entails, but Gibson recognized that what those kids wanted was to enter inside the games, to be in the notional space of the machine. The virtual complicates things a bit, but as we exist now, staring at our screens for hours, Pynchon writes a solid novel showing the experience and stakes of that world, and I hope to keep going in other videos to keep looking down this trajectory of the future of literature.